seonacht chuig an céad léamh den ráta nua ón gcumann seandálaíochta agus staire na Gaillimhe. Is ócáid starálaí seonacht mar is an céad uair atá méid ag creaadh bio an Idirlín. You are all very welcome to this very first live broadcast of one of our lectures in the 120-year history of the Galway Archaeological and Historical Society. Today in September 2020, we are lucky that we have lost only one lecture during the COVID lockdown, and we are determined to carry on with our mission of providing public lectures come what may. This particular lecture is being broadcast exclusively live on the internet. However, and hopefully from next month onward, we plan that the remaining lectures will be run in a blended format if the COVID restrictions allow. That means that we will have a socially distanced audience at our usual venue, the Harbour Hotel in Galway, which will also be simultaneously broadcast live on the internet. Our lectures will continue to take place on the second Monday of the month during the season, which runs from September to April inclusive. The latest information is always available from our website, GAHS.ie, and also through our Facebook and Twitter accounts. And in case many of you want to contact us, our email is info@ghs.ie. Tonight is my honour and privilege to be asked to give this talk on the occasion of our first online lecture of the season. And it's on the subject of the Vickers helmet, also known as the M27 helmet or the Irish German style helmet. Thus this evening I'm going to give you a brief history of the circumstances that led to the Irish Army adopting this helmet and attempt to answer the question, was the Vickers helmet an insult to the British or a British con job? This particular research project resulted from a talk I attended a number of years ago on the subject of Irish military history, during which it was stated that we Irish deliberately chose a German design for our military helmet so as to insult the British. And despite the fact that the helmet was made by the British in the Vickers Armament Company, it was still intended as an insult. Moreover, it was observed during the talk that having insulted the British, we subsequently, and somewhat embarrassingly, had to buy British designed helmets before the outbreak of World War II. I thought to myself, would the army have done that? And what evidence exists to support this claim? A few weeks later, I happened to be staying in Dublin for a few days, and my curiosity drew me to the Irish National Archives. Later, I spent a few days at the Military Archives. The National Archives, lucky enough, have only a few documents in relation to the Vickers helmet, and one of them was a communique from the Irish Legation or Embassy in London, back to the Secretary of the Department of Defence, Anrin Cosenta. As you can see, the letter was dated the 6th of December 1940. This is towards the end of the timeline for tonight's talk, but I thought I'd mention it first as it relates specifically to the issue of the German helmet and immediately convinces me that what many people had suspected and what I had suspected about the history of the helmet was all wrong. The 1940 document outlines an approach that was made to members of the Irish Legation by a British Army officer named Major Kenyon. Apparently Major Kenyon and some elements within the British Army were of the view that the Irish Army's Vickers helmet, in other words the continental German style helmet as they called it, might be superior to the British Army standard Brodie helmet. Major Kenyon requested a sample helmet be sent to him along with the Irish Army's comments and their assessment of it. The Army proved helpful and responded by sending a helmet with a commentary which basically states that it was useless, don't bother with it. In other words, in 1940, just after the beginning of the war, the Irish Army were in fact advising the British Army not to consider changing from their standard British Brodie style helmet to an Irish version of the German helmet because it was substandard. It was now clear to me that the belief that the Irish had chosen the helmet in order to insult the British, or indeed the British had been insulted, was likely wrong. However, in order to provide a full context, we have to go back further in time to the period after the Irish Army was formed in the early 1920s. As I went through hundreds of documents in the archives, a story emerged which reflected the difficulties of setting up a professional army from scratch, and it also revealed a surprising determination on behalf of the Irish Army leadership to procure the best military equipment and also the best equipment to protect its personnel. Even more surprising perhaps was the level of professional communication and cooperation which the Irish Army sought and received from many armies in Europe, but especially from the British and the Americans. There is a much repeated notion which goes that the Irish who fought on the side of the British during the First World War were shunned on their return to Ireland. However, this was not always the case. In 1923, the Irish Army had grown to 58,000 strong. 60% of the enlisted men were ex-British Army and 20% of the officers were too. Indeed, if the Irish men who served in the British armed forces were shunned on their return to Ireland, it was perhaps for reasons other than anti-British sentiment. With the demobilisation of the British Army after World War I, many men returned to Ireland bringing with them syphilis and other venereal diseases. For example, St Ultan's Children's Hospital in Dublin had an astonishing infant mortality rate of 43% during its first year of operation in 1919. This was largely due to the number of babies born with syphilis in Dublin that year. The popular belief that ex-British military men were shunned hides a surprisingly high level of cooperation and goodwill which existed with the old enemy, the British Army. When asked by the authorities in 1926 to supply specification for their helmets, they did so willingly, without hesitancy. In 1926, the Irish Army sent 2 officers for training to the American Army. It resulted in the establishment of the military college corps at the Curragh and service schools in Ireland. Other European armies also sent samples of their helmets to the Army HQ in Dublin on request. Now that I have established a little bit of the background and some of the context, I will from this point forward concentrate on the helmets. The history of the modern battle helmet dates from the First World War, and the necessity for its invention was to protect men from a deadly menace. Most of you will have heard of the surname of this man, but can you name him? His invention killed thousands, probably millions of people worldwide since it was invented in 1784, and it continues to kill thousands of people today. His name was, of course, Colonel Henry Shrapnel. World War I, as most of you know, is a turning point in the history of warfare, primarily due to the unprecedented stalemate situation which existed on the Western Front. Without going into too much detail, military historians often point out that there is a significant lag in formulating and implementing new strategies in response to new technology. For example, the French were sending units into battle during the first weeks of World War I wearing bright shiny armour called cuirass and plumed helmets, a uniform which was well out of date in 1914. In trench warfare of the type that developed and was fought during World War I, a soldier's primary fear is from what dropped on him from above, be it shells, grenades, or an occasionally drop from an airplane. It was only when you peer above the trench, or heavens forbid climb out of it, that you find all the nasty stuff is travelling horizontally. Inside the trenches, men were generally safe from normal bullets or other projectiles travelling horizontally, and so artillery was called upon to make both sides' life very uncomfortable for the men in the opposing trenches. Artillery shells, which trigger when striking the ground, tend to burrow deep in and create a large crater. It won't do anyone standing in the immediate vicinity much good, but outside of a relatively small area, it won't do much harm. It must be remembered that artillery shells cannot be fired with pinpoint accuracy, which is why artillery is fired in a barrage rather than a single strike. The solution to the problem is to use air-bursting artillery shells. This is achieved using a timer set to explode in the air before hitting the ground. The result is that it sprays lethal shrapnel over the trenches with the purpose to kill, maim, incapacitate as many soldiers as possible. Of course, most of the time this blunt description is unpalatable, so it's euphemistically described as anti-personnel weapon. Here you can see a German timer fuse, graduated in seconds I presume, And here we have also a British soldier setting the timer to be fitted to an artillery round. The inside of the round was fitted with shrapnel bullets, and they were deployed using secondary explosive charge. In theory, hundreds of soldiers could be wiped out by one single artillery shell. In response to this development, the trenches were often built using a zigzag pattern as a countermeasure. This is an aerial photo of the trenches in World War I. Zigzag trenches were not enough, and further countermeasures such as an appropriate helmet were also needed. At this time, all armies used cloth caps except for some German units which wore a pickelhaube, made from boiled leather and later mild steel. French soldiers wore the famous kepi cap, which they often covered with their mess or food tins for protection. The sight of mess tins used as a form of head protection moved the French army authorities to provide their men with better protection, or at least give them a better look. The French became the first army to supply their soldiers with a steel helmet in 1915. Accordingly, the design of the first modern military helmet is credited to Auguste Louis Adrien, and the helmet is known as the Adrien helmet. It is a rather stylish helmet and was sold to national armies of many countries worldwide. On the German side, a proposal for improving the head protection available to German soldiers came from a medic by the name of Dr. Friedrich Schwerd, who studied the nature of wounds suffered by soldiers returning from the Western Front. He wrote to the army authorities in Berlin, noting that the huge number of head injuries. He urged the army authorities to issue the men with steel helmets. Shortly after he submitted his recommendation for using steel helmets, Schwerd was ordered to the famous German Army's Kummersdorf Weapons Research Facility, located 25 kilometres south of Berlin. Space enthusiasts will recognise this name, for it's the very place where the race to space and the moon was born. Werner von Braun worked here during the 1930s and 40s, developing rockets, and before moving the operation to Peenemünde. After the Second World War, he worked for NASA, where he was the chief architect of the Saturn V rocket, which landed men on the moon. However, back in 1915 at Kummersdorf, Dr. Schwerd took to the history books and chose a medieval Salle helmet as the basis of his design. Around the same time in 1915, the British were also thumbing through the history books, looking at old helmet designs, and based their design on another medieval helmet known as the kettle hat. The old kettle hat had been designed primarily for siege warfare. In sieges, especially when in close to a defensive wall, all the nasty stuff comes from above. As you can clearly see in this image, it is worn on top of the head, offering no protection to projectiles travelling horizontally. That was exactly what was intended when the army were stuck in the trenches, but it was of little use outside the trench or a foxhole. And it appears clear that when we compare the two helmets, that the German version allows for significantly greater protection for the wearer. This prompts a further question as to why the British entered World War II with a helmet which was not suitable for open field warfare. The answer to that question is that the British lagged sufficiently behind the Germans in steel technology. Both helmets were made from steel alloy, the British from manganese steel and the German from silicon nickel steel. The problem was that the British could only press manganese steel into a very shallow depth. This is why it looked like a saucer, their helmet. The Germans had the ability to press steel to a much greater depth, a level much deeper, which allowed for greater protection of a greater area of the head. And it might have given some neck protection in some instances. I found this on video online showing a style helmet being made dating from around 1940. But it would have been largely the same process which was employed from 1916 or 1917, even 1915 onwards. There are a few things to look out for as we go through the video. The first thing is that you press a flat sheet of steel into a shape using a die which goes into a tool down like that, and the shape emerges, so you have a positive and negative. The helmet was pressed out in 3 separate stages. You can clearly see the 3 pressings as we progressively go through the video. Also note the use of heated dyes. You can see the steam rising from them. And watch out for the guy who can take 4 red helmets from the furnace, dump them in oil and replace them with 4 more on a still burning dolly and back into the furnace in seconds. That's very important because it's the heating and the cooling which hardens the helmet, cooling at a certain rate. Also notice that the helmets are being tested using a rifle.
Für unsere Soldaten. Vor dem Pressen werden die rundgeschnittenen Platten aus Chrom-Nickel-Stahl in Seifenwasser gebadet. Das Pressen erfolgt in mehreren Arbeitsgängen. Hier werden die Ränder der Helme sorgfältig überarbeitet. In einem Glühofen wird der Chrom-Nickel-Stahl, der nun zu Helmen geworden ist, geglüht und dann in einem Ölbad gehärtet. Der Stahlhelm erhält seine Farbe. Das Auftragen des Hoheitszeichens erfolgt mit Hilfe von Abziehbildern. Das Fassleder wird eingesetzt. Im Trockenständer. Immer wieder werden einzelne Helme herausgenommen und Beschussproben unterzogen. Die Federwirkung des Materials hat das Geschoss zurückgeschleudert. So ist der Stahlhelm, zu dem Geheimrat Bier während des Weltkrieges die Idee gab, ein sicherer Schutz für unsere Soldaten.
So we're turning now to the Irish element of the story. Upon gaining independence, Ireland was left devoid of an industrial base. This was due in part to the fact that the ingredients for an industrial revolution, chiefly deposits of coal and iron, were not part of the country's national resources, and so it had to turn to other countries to buy steel products. At the very start of the process of choosing a helmet, the new Irish Army did exactly what would be expected of competent management and set about procuring a number of sample helmets of different designs for evaluation. Based at least partially on aesthetics, and the army authorities did initially consider purchasing the pretty looking lightweight French Adrian helmets which I mentioned earlier. However, the Irish Army tests of the Adrian helmet and a number of other European helmets proved the samples to be unsatisfactory. All European helmets tested by the Irish Army, only the British Brodie helmet and the German Stahl helmet proved resistance to high-speed shrapnel. Moreover, the test showed that the German helmet outperformed the British helmet by a considerable distance, especially when the depth of dents made by testing bullets was measured. Furthermore, the Irish Army were likely aware that the Brodie helmet was hated by the British servicemen. In 1930, one Irish officer, Major Anthony Ladover, based at the Curragh in County Kildare, noted that many British soldiers complained that the Brodie helmet wobbles on the head and has to be tied on very tightly. He observed that the British Army don't use it in their parades in public display, and he took that to be that they were not proud of it. You don't have to be a military engineer to see the obvious drawbacks of the Brodie design. You can see in this image that the very bottom of the helmet only came down to above the eyebrows, which was perfectly in line with the medieval design criteria of protecting from projectiles descending from above. As the design of the helmet offered many advantages over all others available on the market, The Irish Army set about to find a manufacturer who would make a German design helmet, as the British generally refer to it as the one of continental design. Several companies responded to the Irish Army's request for an expression of interest. Mention the word Sheffield and everyone thinks of steel. The city was once the very heart of the British steel industry, and it was companies based in Sheffield who expressed an expression of interest in fulfilling the Irish contract. One of the most famous of the city's steel companies was called Hadfield Steel. In mid-December 1926, Hadfield responded to the request from the Irish Army regarding the specifications of the helmet and said it was not possible to manufacture the helmet to the depth required. Furthermore, they state emphatically that the American helmet, which was an improved version of the Brodie helmet, was the limit in terms of depth using hard alloy steel. However, and again I stress the importance of this, the Irish Army in the coming months would learn that Hadfield's steel were wrong because their own testing had revealed that the Germans could indeed manufacture such a helmet using to that depth using alloy steel. Thus what Hadfields were really saying was, and this was the limit of British steel technology, and that the Americans were only slightly ahead. And so in stepped the Vickers company, who also had a large steelworks in Sheffield, who must have also given the impression to the Irish Army that they too thought that Hadfields were wrong. Vickers claimed they could manufacture a helmet to the specification, no problem at all. Notwithstanding Vickers' claims, the Irish took steps to protect against the common false promises of a salesperson and prudently insisted on overseeing the testing and quality control production at Sheffield. Accordingly, when the contract was awarded to Vickers and when production began, the Irish Army dispatched Commandant Dan Stapleton to the factory at Sheffield, where he was to personally subject every 10th helmet pressing to a ballistic firing test. An internal Irish document dated April 1927 comments that 2,000 samplings were ready for manufacturing. 19 were tested by Commandant Stapleton on the 30th and 31st of March 1927. His report back to Dublin indicates that all helmets passed with flying colours. Note the use of the word stampings. These tests could have been carried out on steel dinner plates, early stampings if you like, rather than fully pressed helmets. The Vickers helmets began arriving back in Ireland with a delivery of 800 units in November 1927, of a total order of 10,000. The order would not be complete until 1930-1931. Provision was made for the payment of £2,626. The new helmets were initially received by the Irish Army, were regarded as aesthetically pleasing, but due to testing in Sheffield, were regarded as superior to what was available to most European armies. One further note is that the Vickers helmet had distinctive lugs or horns on either side of the helmet. In the original German design, these lugs were used to secure various attachments to the helmet, which included a sniper's visor, an extra armour plate, or as you can see in these images, both of these also worked as ventilation holes. And you can see in later models of the Stahlhelm that the ventilation holes were kept minus the lugs. However, despite the initial excitement, by June 1928, the Irish Army Chief of Staff was hearing complaints about the helmet from some officers, particularly on the quality. And he indicates that testing is to take place by the Artillery Corps at the Glen of Imal in County Wicklow. In other words, simply firing for bullets at a helmet, as Commandant Stapleton had done in Sheffield, was now would be subject to a realistic test that might occur during war. On the 5th of July 1928, 5 brand new helmets were subjected to shrapnel fire from artillery weapons. The helmets were completely penetrated by shrapnel bullets, making exit and entrance holes. That was the first 3. A 4th had a hole and a large dent on the other side, and a 5th was badly dented but no penetration. Because it takes some time before the grumblings of officers make it to the Chief of Staff of the Army, and even longer to make it to paper, we can infer from the very moment when the helmets arrived in Ireland, some Army officers were unhappy with the quality and were vindicated by the shrapnel tests. Nearly 2 months later, on the 28th of August 1928, a detailed report on the artillery test followed, signed by Major P. Mulcahy, officer commanding the Artillery Corps. He detailed the various speeds at which artillery shrapnel travels, which was in excess of the design capability of the helmet. Allied to the fact that it was impossible to direct artillery fire with scientific accuracy, rather than write the helmets off, he recommends that further testing be carried out. So even though the Vickers helmets proved to be somewhat bulletproof, the fact that they did not meet the design specification of resisting shrapnel travelling at 700 feet per second seems to have been a great source of disappointment for the Irish Army. I should mention that no helmet was designed to withstand a shot from the rifle. Put more simply, Vickers had reneged on their commitment. It was now clear that they were not in fact capable of producing a deeper German style helmet to the necessary specifications, while also maintaining the strength of the steel employed. The Irish helmets were substandard, and had the Irish been conned? A possible hint is present in the letter from Vickers to the Irish Department of Defence in late April 1927, a few weeks after Commandant Stapleton had carried out his test in Sheffield. In the correspondence, Vickers claimed that they are experiencing production difficulties and have delayed output of the helmets temporarily, stating that, "In these circumstances, we hesitate to ask for a visit for inspection of the 250 helmets only, especially as we expect any day to overcome the difficulty regarding future supplies." Vickers were requesting that only specifically prepared specimens be tested, and that the Army take them at their word that the rest of the helmets will be manufactured to specification. I found no evidence to suggest that the Irish refused to accept Vickers' request or question their bona fides in this regard. Thus, it's at least possible that the specimens provided by Vickers were hardened in some way, or the weapon they provided for testing may have been reduced a little bit in power. Whatever the case was, all the pressings passed the test. Whatever the truth may be, the reality is that the Irish were now left with approximately 10,000 helmets that were not of the desired specification. Accordingly, in 1930, the Army decided not to order any more helmets and leave the public money for other uses. Nonetheless, the debate continued over whether or not it was better to stick with the Vickers helmet, improve it, or start again and buy new ones. One attempt was made to test if the wearability of the helmet could be improved, and a small number of helmet inserts were purchased from Germany. It appears that when fitted, they were indeed an improvement. However, the major problem was with the strength of the shell, and that required the ordering of entirely new helmets. However, prior to any new helmets being purchased, and learning from its bad experience with the Vickers company, the Army gave top priority to the acquisition of a suitable testing weapon. The Irish asked the British Army to supply a weapon which could fire a shrapnel bullet at the specified speed of 700 feet per second. In March 1938, the British Army responded, sending a document containing its own testing weapon specifications, and put the Irish in touch with a commercial armaments company, who in turn duly dispatched a testing weapon to Ireland, arriving in 1939. While this process was in motion, the Army received a letter in October 1938 from John Brodie, the designer of the British helmet, which was originally addressed to the Right Honourable Eamon de Valera. He met Dev sometime earlier when both were in New York. He wrote boastfully that the British and American helmets were the only successful helmet used in the Great War. Dev passed the letter on to the Army, where it now sits in their archives. As war loomed on the horizon again in Europe, the army decided that the most expedient course of action was to purchase British Brodie helmets. If the Irish army could not procure the best, then it had to settle for second best. Now again, to correct a common misconception, the new Brodie helmets were issued in 1940. That's after the war had started. The old Vickers helmets were retired and repainted white and passed on to emergency organisations like the Civil Defence. After that war, they were all dumped in landfill, and the few which now survive command high prices on the military market. As I indicated nearly at the start of this talk, I was surprised to find that there was a complete lack of published research in the public domain about the helmet. Even the present-day Irish Army seem unaware of the ardent pursuit in obtaining best quality equipment of their predecessors. In 2013, the Irish Army published a pictorial history of itself to commemorate the centenary of its founding, which it regarded as the formation of the Irish Volunteers in 1913. What was chiefly notable about the publication was that apart from a drawing of an old recruitment poster in which indistinctly were depicted soldiers wearing a Vickers helmet, not a single photo showing the Vickers helmet appeared in its history. It is likely that the Irish Army are embarrassed by this German-style helmet worn by their predecessors. This is perhaps understandable. The distinctive shape of the Stahlhelm is now rather synonymous with the German armies of World War I and World War II. And perhaps for that reason, the Irish Army would prefer not to highlight the military's previous use of the same helmet design. Additionally, as I mentioned at the outset, there is also the impression in some quarters that the decision to adopt the helmet in the late 1920s may have been a deliberate snub towards the British. As I have revealed here tonight, through the examination of the actual evidence, this cannot be the case. In fact, we have learned in World War II, the British sent their troops into battle with helmets which were not suited to the job. And the British Army were well aware of this. And the approach of the British Major to the Irish Legation in London in 1940 revealed that the British were themselves at least considering a switch to the German helmet at the start of the war. Had the Irish Army looked in their own archives, they would have no doubt been extremely proud to discover the strenuous efforts made by its own officers during its formative years to seek out and commission the manufacture of the best possible protection for its personnel. To put that in context, the British inferiority in steel technology and production was the primary cause of both armies having inferior helmets. From the evidence, it is not unreasonable to speculate that if the Vickers helmet had met the Irish Army specification, the British would have changed to their very own version of the Stahlhelm in the early 1940s. In actual fact, they did so many years later, and both the British and American battle helmets of the late 20th century and early 21st century can trace their design origins to the German Stahlhelm, which you can see from this photo. So was the adoption of the helmet by the Irish Army meant as an insult to the British? I do not believe so. Was the supply of the helmets to the Irish Army something of a British con job pulled by Vickers? Possibly. After hearing the evidence presented this evening, I shall now leave you to make your own decision. Thank you very much. Begin questions and answers.